Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, gritty, and honestly pretty disgusting reality of food in medieval times. Forget juicy roasts or hearty stews. Most meals were barely edible, and some could literally kill you. Life wasn't just hard back then. Eating was a daily gamble, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let's get into why food seriously sucked in the Middle Ages. Imagine you've worked 12 hours hauling stones, tending fields, or cleaning up after livestock. Your body aches. Your hands are cracked. Your stomach growls like a beast. And what's waiting for you at home? A bowl of lukewarm sludge that tastes like boiled weeds. Because that's basically what it is. Welcome to dinner, 1347. This wasn't some bad day or failed recipe. This was the norm for the average person in medieval Europe. Food wasn't a pleasure. It wasn't comfort. It was a calculation. How to survive the day without starving, getting sick, or breaking a tooth on stale bread. Let's go deeper. The backbone of the peasant diet was something called pottage, a thick, soupy mess made from boiling whatever grains, vegetables, and scraps were available. No recipes, no spices, just boiling and hoping it was edible. Some families had pottage every single day of their lives. Morning, night, sometimes with bread, sometimes not, often with a dash of dirt or a surprise insect. And speaking of bread, today we think of it as this warm, fluffy thing that brings people together. Back then, it was a game of chance. Bread was often made with coarsely ground grain, full of bits of stone from the mill. Eating it wore down your teeth like sandpaper. It could also be stretched with things like powdered beans, old flour, or even sawdust. If you bought it from a shady baker in town, you might be biting into something more filler than flour. Still hungry, water wasn't safe to drink. So people, kids included, drank ale. Not the fun kind, though. Weak, barely fermented, often sour ale that sometimes tasted like the barrel it was stored in. And yes, this was considered safer than water, because medieval rivers and wells were often full of everything you don't want to think about. Now imagine being a woman trying to stretch one dried onion, half a cabbage, and a handful of oats to feed 5 people for 3 days. That was a typical challenge. People got creative, sure, but creativity doesn't add calories. It doesn't fight scurvy. It doesn't make the hunger go away. Fruit, a luxury. Meat, a dream. Cheese, only if you had a cow or could trade with someone who did. Most protein came from legumes, beans, peas, when they were in season. In winter, good luck. And this is before we even talk about preservation. No fridges, no ice, just salt, smoke, or drying. And if it didn't work, well, too bad. You might eat it anyway and hope for the best. Food poisoning wasn't just a possibility. It was part of life. No one knew what bacteria were, but they definitely knew that food sometimes killed. Even the rich weren't entirely safe. Sure, they had more variety. Boar, venison, pies stuffed with birds and spices. But preservation and hygiene were still medieval. Fancy dishes could rot before reaching the table. Spices covered the taste of spoilage, not added flavor. So why was food so bad? Because everything about the medieval world was set up to make survival hard. Bad roads meant limited trade. Bad storage meant spoilage. Bad farming tools meant tiny yields. And bad luck meant famine. There were years when crops failed and people ate bark, boiled leather, or worse. In 1315, it rained so much that entire fields turned to mud. Grain couldn't grow. Animals died. People starved. Some rumors spoke of cannibalism. But here's the wild part. People adapted. They endured. They kept going. Food was shared. Recipes, such as they were passed down. Hunger became a constant companion, but never the final word. So tonight, as you tuck in with a full belly, or maybe snack between episodes, remember that just a few centuries ago, most people went to bed with gnawing hunger and dreams of cheese and bread that didn't chip a tooth. Sleep tight, because tomorrow we step into the shoes of a medieval peasant to live one full day of meals. If you can even call them that. It's morning in a medieval village. The sun is still low, casting long shadows through the mist. A rooster crows, loud and insistent. Not that anyone really needed a wake-up call. The villagers are already stirring. Sleep is a luxury, and today's hunger won't feed itself. Our peasant wakes on a straw mattress. No sheets, no pillows, just an itchy blanket and the soft, cold reality of another hard day. The smell of smoke from the hearth clings to everything. His stomach growls before his feet even hit the floor. Breakfast? If you can call it that, it's the same as yesterday and the day before. A chunk of yesterday's bread, dry, dense, and maybe a little moldy, and a cup of weak ale. No milk, no honey, no eggs, just enough to keep from fainting by midday. And if it's a lucky morning, maybe there's a clove of garlic or a spoonful of cold pottage from last night's pot. There's no time to savor it. The fields call. Whether it's planting, harvesting, or hauling stones, it's all backbreaking. Lunch will be hours away, and it won't be any better. Tools are gathered, the oxen are hitched, and the long walk to the fields begins. Along the way, he greets a neighbor who is chewing on a strip of dried turnip like it is a delicacy. By noon, the sun is brutal. Sweat clings to every surface, and the body begs for rest. Under the shade of a tree, he unwraps his midday meal. It's a small leather pouch with a bit of pottage, cold now, thick and lumpy. It's been made with cabbage and onions, maybe a few wild herbs his wife found nearby. No salt. Salt costs more than he makes in weeks. The meal is quiet, shared with a few others. They talk about the upcoming harvest and the rumors of a noble tax increase. He eats with his fingers. The wooden spoon broke last week. His hands are dirty. But washing them is a luxury. And besides, it's not like the water is clean anyway. There might be a small apple, if it's autumn and the orchard hasn't been picked clean by others. Sometimes, he's lucky. A neighbor might share a bit of cheese or a boiled egg if one of the hens was generous. But most days, lunch is just fuel. No joy, no flavor, just a necessary pause before returning to labor. The wind picks up and stirs the dust. Some falls into the food, but he eats it anyway. Hunger cares little for hygiene. As the sun dips toward the horizon, the work slows, but never really ends. Animals need tending. Tools need fixing. That aching back isn't going to stretch itself. The kids help gather firewood, and one of them chases off a crow that's been eyeing the chicken coop all day. Finally, dinner. The whole family gathers inside their one-room home. The fire burns low. A large pot of pottage hangs over the flames again, because what else could it be? It's thicker now, having stewed all day. That's something at least. There's a small loaf of bread, too. It's hard as stone, so they dip it in the stew to soften it. It doesn't work. Still, the smell is familiar, comforting in its predictability. Conversation is minimal. Everyone is too tired. Children pick at their food. One of them asks for more, but there isn't any. The youngest cries from hunger and is hushed with a piece of bread crust. A neighbor drops by to exchange a small onion for a bowl of stew. It's a fair deal. The meal ends with nothing sweet, no dessert, no fruit, just silence and sleep. The dog licks the pot clean, not out of training, but necessity. It's the only food he'll get tonight. The fire dies slowly. People curl up together for warmth. Stomachs are not full, but not empty either. It's enough. And in the Middle Ages, that's already a win. The wind outside howls, and someone places a clay jar against the door to keep the draft out. This wasn't a bad day. This was a good one. No one went hungry. No one got sick. The pottage didn't burn, and the bread didn't run out. The cow didn't wander off. The rats stayed out of the grain. But tomorrow is another gamble. A storm might flood the fields. A rat might chew through the grain stores. The cow might stop giving milk. Or worse, a messenger might arrive announcing new taxes or forced labor. So as you lie in your bed, surrounded by snacks and comfort, think about what it meant to eat in medieval times. It wasn't about taste. It wasn't about choice. It was about endurance. It was about getting just enough to make it to the next sunrise. And that's a day in the life of a peasant's meal. Plain, repetitive, exhausting, and absolutely essential. Sleep well. We'll see you at the next table, in another corner of the past. It's easy to forget, in a world of refrigerators and 24-hour supermarkets, just how fragile food used to be back in the Middle Ages. Eating wasn't just a matter of appetite. It was a constant negotiation with time, weather, and decay. Let's rewind the clock. Imagine it's late autumn. The air is crisp, the leaves are falling, and there's a nervous energy in the village. Not because of the beauty, but because everyone knows what's coming. Winter, and winter meant scarcity. There were no greenhouses, no frozen vegetables, no canned beans waiting on a shelf. If food wasn't grown, gathered, or preserved during the right season, it simply wouldn't be there when the snow came. So, families preserved what they could. Every part of the harvest was precious. Apples were sliced and hung to dry in the rafters. Herbs were bundled and strung like garlands. Beans were shelled and laid out to harden. Cabbages were buried in cool cellars or turned into sour, fermented versions of themselves. Meat was smoked, salted, or dried, if you had it. But salt was expensive. Smoking required time and wood. Not everyone could afford to lose either. A slaughtered pig might feed a family for months, but only if preserved right. If it went bad, there was no second chance. Fish, if you lived near water, became a vital part of the diet. Herring, eels, or dried cod, anything that could survive a long winter without rotting. It wasn't gourmet, but it was sustenance. Milk couldn't be stored, so it became butter or cheese. Eggs could only be preserved for short periods by submerging them in lime water or packing them in ash. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, were hardy, but even they had limits. Potatoes didn't exist in Europe yet. Neither did tomatoes. And forget about citrus. So what happened when the food ran out? People got creative. They boiled bones into broth. They baked bread from mashed acorns. They made thin gruels from dried peas and anything remotely edible. But eventually, you could do everything right, preserve every last scrap, and still find your pantry bare before spring. That's when hunger turned dangerous. People scavenged. They stole. They begged. They chewed bark or boiled shoe leather. Some even ate the seeds meant for planting. And in the worst years, people died. Historians speak of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rain destroyed crops across Europe. Fields turned to mud. Livestock drowned. Grain rotted in storage. Prices skyrocketed. And ordinary people, millions of them, simply starved. This wasn't rare. It wasn't shocking. It was part of life. To live in the Middle Ages was to fear the seasons. Spring brought hope. Summer brought labor. Autumn brought urgency. And winter brought reckoning. Every year, the pantry was like an hourglass, and every bite taken was a grain of sand slipping through. Even feasting followed this logic. When a pig was slaughtered, the whole village might eat fresh meat for days, not just to celebrate, but because fresh meant now. There was no saving it for later, unless it was salted or smoked that same day. The most successful peasants weren't the strongest. They were the ones who knew how to make food last, who planted wisely, who rotated crops, who bartered extra eggs for dried herbs, who stored their grains in sealed barrels to keep out mice. And when spring finally returned, it wasn't with flowers and joy. It was with hard work and frantic planting, because the next countdown had already begun. So next time you walk into a kitchen and open a full fridge, remember that for most of human history, preservation wasn't about taste. It wasn't about shelf life. It was about staying alive. Sleep well tonight, knowing your pantry isn't a gamble. And when we meet again, we'll uncover the secrets people used to stretch their food. Even when the harvest failed, imagine trying to keep food fresh without a fridge. No ice, no plastic wrap, no glass jars with rubber seals. Just the passing seasons, open air, and whatever clever tricks you could come up with. Welcome to the medieval pantry, a place where surviving winter meant outsmarting nature, pests, and time itself. In the Middle Ages, food preservation wasn't optional. It was survival. Let's say it's late summer. The fields are full. Apples weigh down the trees. The last of the beans are drying on their stalks. This is the moment of abundance, but also panic, because everyone knows what's coming. Winter, cold, dark, hungry winter. The goal now isn't just to eat. It's to stretch, to store, to prepare. Drying was one of the most common methods. Fruits, herbs, legumes, all could be laid out under the sun or hung in warm, dry lofts to lose their moisture. A string of onions braided and swaying above the hearth. Apples sliced and left near the window. Beans shelled and left in baskets. The idea was simple. No moisture, no rot. Smoking was another trusted trick. Meat was precious, so when a pig was finally slaughtered, nothing could go to waste. Strips of bacon, sausages, and hams were hung over smoldering fires for days. The smoke not only dried them, it infused them with bacteria-fighting compounds. Plus, it gave them a flavor that, compared to pottage, was practically gourmet. Then there was salting, and this was serious business. Salt was expensive, but it could pull moisture from meat or fish, helping it last for weeks, even months. In coastal towns, whole fishing industries revolved around catching, salting, and drying cod or herring. Inland, Salt mines were worth their weight in gold. Some towns existed purely to produce and trade salt. Pickling was common too, though it looked very different from today's bright green cucumbers in clean jars. In medieval kitchens, vegetables were submerged in brine or soured in ale dregs, left in ceramic crocks sealed with fat or wax. It was messy, it was unpredictable, but it often worked. And then there was fermentation. This ancient technique made everything from ale to sauerkraut to sourdough bread. It required patience and faith and a good deal of trial and error. Yeasts were invisible mysteries. No one understood why the dough rose or the beer bubbled. But when it worked, it was magic. Food that not only lasted, but sometimes tasted better than it had fresh. But here's the dark truth. Even with all these methods, most preserved food was a gamble. You might open a crock and find mold, bite into a strip of smoked meat and taste rot, cut open a dried apple and find it hollowed out by worms. And sometimes, despite all the effort, everything spoiled anyway. A damp summer, a cold snap, a burst jug, a mouse infestation. Suddenly, your winter supply vanished overnight. That's when the real hunger began. Scarcity was the default setting. People had to ration, sometimes painfully. The first months of winter were manageable, but by late February or March, the so-called hungry gap, things got desperate. The stores ran low, the root cellar emptied, meals shrank, people got sick. In some years, famine swept through entire regions. Crops failed, rivers flooded, granaries burned, and food prices soared. Those with money could buy their way through. Those without had to beg, borrow, or starve. In towns, bakers were accused of mixing chalk into flour to stretch their supply. Brewers watered down ale. Merchants hoarded grain to raise prices. And always, the church preached that suffering purified the soul. Convenient. In these hard months, even weeds had value. Nettles, dandelions, wild garlic, anything green that could be boiled into soup. People made bread from ground-up tree bark, porridge from acorns. Yes, really, children died. The elderly wasted away. And still, the survivors pressed on, because the spring would come, hopefully, and with it, new seeds, a new chance. All of this paints a bleak picture, but it wasn't without wisdom. Medieval people were experts in seasonality. They knew how to preserve life with nothing but fire, stone, salt, and instinct. They passed down techniques, rituals, and recipes. They planned their lives around harvest cycles and weather patterns, and through all of it, they held on to hope. So tonight, as your fridge hums and your pantry glows with LED light, spare a thought for those who stared down winter with nothing but jars of pickled cabbage and prayer. This was food preservation in the Middle Ages. Not perfect, not easy, but it kept people alive. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we'll uncover what happened when even these methods failed, and food turned from survival into danger. Imagine biting into a slice of bread and realizing it tastes like chalk, or drinking a cup of ale that smells oddly like pond water. In the Middle Ages, these weren't rare accidents. They were features of the food system. Welcome to a time when food could lie to you, where what you ate might not just be disappointing, it might be deadly. Let's start with bread, the so-called staff of life. For peasants, it was the main meal, the fallback food, the daily staple. But good flour was expensive, and millers didn't always have pure grain to work with. So they got creative, or dishonest, to stretch their supply. bakers and millers would mix in fillers, powdered beans, rye husks, clay, or even ground chalk and sawdust. These ingredients made the flour heavier, which meant more profit when sold by weight. But they also made bread less nutritious and a lot harder on the stomach and the teeth. Authorities tried to regulate this. In London, bakers were subject to the assize of bread, a law that determined how much bread should weigh for a set price. If caught cheating, a baker might be fined, publicly shamed, or even tossed into the pillory. Still, the practice continued. Why? Because demand was high, and hunger is not picky. It wasn't just bread. A lait, the drink of choice for most, was also frequently tampered with. A lait was everywhere, safer than water, more filling than nothing. It was brewed in almost every home and tavern. But good ale required good malt and clean water. Both could be expensive or scarce. So brewers cut corners. They watered it down. They reused dregs from old batches. They skipped fermentation steps. Some even added herbs or chemicals to simulate the taste of hops, long before hops were common in brewing. The result? Sour, inconsistent, and sometimes toxic drinks. Still, people drank it. Because what else could they do? Milk could be thinned. Cheese might be stretched with chalk or mashed beans. Butter could be mixed with lard. And meat, when available, wasn't always what it claimed to be. A merchant might promise pork and sell bad mutton. Or worse, dog or rat. In big cities, street food vendors became infamous for shady swaps. You never really knew what you were biting into. But why so much deception? Simple. There were no labels, no inspections, no refrigeration. The line between necessity and fraud was thin. For poor vendors trying to survive, a bit of trickery meant staying in business. For customers, suspicion was part of the meal. Even the rich weren't immune. Their feasts were full of exotic dishes, pastries shaped like animals, fish disguised as birds. It was culinary theater, but even there, ingredients might be swapped or stretched. Almond milk, for instance, was common among nobles during fasting days, but almonds were expensive, so cooks made fake versions with breadcrumbs, flour, and a lot of hope. This culture of trickery created a strange atmosphere around food. Eating became not just a matter of taste or hunger, but of risk. Every bite was a question mark. Is this bread safe? Is this ale real? Will this stew make me sick? Or worse, some people got good at spotting fakes. They avoided certain cellars. They learned to test grain by its smell, or ale by its foam. Word of mouth was everything. A bad baker could lose his customers, or find himself at the business end of a mob. But even vigilance wasn't always enough. Food-related illnesses were common. Stomach cramps, vomiting, fevers. Sometimes entire communities got sick from one bad batch. And in an age without hospitals, without antibiotics, that could be a death sentence. Still, people adapted. They didn't expect food to be perfect. They expected it to be risky. Meals were approached with caution, not trust. So tonight, as you sip a clean glass of water, or nibble on something you didn't, to have to question, think about what it meant to eat in medieval times. Deception was part of the diet, and truth was often out of reach. Sleep well. Next, we'll dive into the grimy, grim world of medieval kitchens, where filth, disease, and dinner came dangerously close together. Imagine cooking dinner in a kitchen with no running water, no soap, no refrigerator, and a dirt floor shared with chickens. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, a place where filth and food danced dangerously close, and where getting sick from your stew was just part of life. Let's be clear, hygiene as we know it today didn't exist. The idea that invisible germs could make you sick, totally unknown. People associated illness with bad smells, evil spirits, or imbalances in the body's humors. So cleaning a kitchen wasn't about sanitation. It was about appearance, or sometimes religious ritual. Imagine waking up hungry, but not being allowed to eat what you have. There's meat in the house, but today is a fast day, not a diet, a rule, one that, if broken, could put your soul at risk. Welcome to the church's kitchen, the place where faith, food, and fear were stirred together daily. In medieval Europe, what you ate wasn't just about survival or taste. It was about salvation. The church didn't just guide your prayers, it governed your plate. Through a complex system of feasts, fasts, and forbidden foods, the church shaped medieval diets with divine authority. Let's start with the basics. There were over 140 fast days on the church calendar. That's more than 1/3 of the year. On these days, Christians were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs. No bacon, no butter, no cheese. In some cases, even cooking with animal fat was off limits. Fish, however, was allowed. Why? Because the church considered creatures of the sea to be spiritually cleaner, or at least not of the flesh. This led to a booming fish trade and some very creative reclassifications. Beavers, technically, lived in water. Therefore, fish, puffins, nested on cliffs by the sea. Therefore, fish. The line between animal and acceptable was blurry at best. But it wasn't just about what you ate. It was also about when. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was the most intense fasting season. Entire communities changed their menus. Ale might be replaced with thin soups. Rich pies gave way to bland porridge. Even kings had to observe it, although their fasts were considerably more luxurious. Monasteries set the tone. Monks followed strict diets, often eating once or twice a day, and never indulging. Their meals were plain, silent, and structured. They became models of restraint and set the expectations for the rest of society. If a monk could survive on leeks and beans, why couldn't a merchant do the same? Breaking a fast wasn't just a personal slip-up, it was a sin. Confession, penance, and sometimes public shame followed. In towns, butchers and bakers were monitored. Selling meat on a fast day could land you in court, or worse, in the stocks. But of course, people found loopholes. Wealthy households employed cooks who specialized in fast day cuisine, fish pies, almond milk sauces, fake eggs made from breadcrumbs and herbs. The creativity was impressive and exhausting. Still, for the rich, fasting became less about sacrifice and more about substitution. For the poor, it was different. Many already lived with restricted diets. They didn't need a church mandate to avoid meat. They couldn't afford it. Fast days just made their usual suffering official. The church also dictated feast days, celebrations where abundance was encouraged. Easter, Christmas, saints' days. On these occasions, meat flowed freely. Ale was poured. Bread was baked fresh. It was a sanctioned break from deprivation, a moment when hunger gave way to joy. But even these were under the church's gaze. Gluttony was a sin. So was drunkenness. So was pride in one's food. You could enjoy a feast, but not too much. Celebrate, but stay humble. Be full, but never greedy. It was a moral balancing act, one that played out on every plate. There were deeper meanings too. Fasting wasn't just about obedience. It was about discipline, purity, suffering in imitation of Christ. Food became a form of worship or a test of faith. Each bite was a choice between earthly pleasure and heavenly reward. Children were taught these rules from a young age. They learned which days were lean and which were rich. They memorized saints' names, feast dates, the logic of the liturgical calendar. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was religious education. And in times of crisis, famine, plague, war, the church's rules offered structure. When the world felt out of control, the calendar still held. The rituals remained. A fast day was still a fast day, even if all you had was turnip soup. But not everyone obeyed. In secret, people broke the rules. They ate meat on forbidden days. They drank too much on holy nights. They traded butter for indulgences. The church preached, but it couldn't watch every plate. Faith, like hunger, was personal. So tonight, as you choose your meal, without judgment, without fear of sin, remember the centuries when dinner was dictated by doctrine, when the kitchen was a pulpit and the pantry a place of penance. This was the church's grip on the medieval diet, binding, shaping, and sanctifying every bite. Sleep well. Next, we enter the halls of the rich, where food wasn't just survival, but spectacle. Start with the basics. Most homes had a central hearth, not a stove, not a counter, just a fire pit in the middle of the floor. Smoke filled the room constantly. There were no chimneys in most peasant homes, just a hole in the roof, if you were lucky. Everything was covered in soot. Walls, pots, food, people. The floor, dirt, packed earth, maybe sprinkled with rushes or straw to soak up spills, which were never really cleaned. Instead, they were trampled down or left for dogs, pigs, or rats to clean up. Yes, rats. They were a common kitchen guest. Now picture the tools. Wooden spoons, iron pots, ceramic jugs, no antibacterial anything. Utensils were rarely washed, and when they were, it was with cold or slightly warm water, sometimes mixed with ash, if available. Soap existed, but it was expensive and mostly used for clothes, not hands. And hands. People didn't wash them before cooking. At best, they wiped them on an apron or tunic already stained with soot and grease. Between gutting animals, kneading dough, and feeding the fire, hands were always dirty, but no one thought twice about using them to mix the family's meal. Storage was another nightmare. No refrigeration meant food spoiled fast. Meat might be salted or smoked, but if you had leftovers, you hung them from the ceiling to keep them from the dog, or tucked them in a cool corner and hoped they didn't turn. Flies were everywhere. Open windows, open food, no screens, no sprays, just buzzing, landing, laying eggs. And yes, sometimes people noticed larvae crawling in their meals. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't even a deal breaker. And then there were the animals. Chickens lived indoors. So did goats, sometimes pigs. Their waste ended up in the same spaces where people ate and slept. When it rained, the mess turned into mud, and mud found its way into everything. Diseases thrived in this environment. Dysentery, typhoid, food poisoning. But these weren't isolated incidents. They were normal. A stomach ache after dinner? Just part of the risk. Vomiting? Probably something you ate. Maybe that meat was too old. Maybe the water was contaminated. Maybe the pottage had been reheated one too many times. Speaking of water, there wasn't always a nearby source. Many homes shared a single well. Buckets were used and reused. And if the well was downhill from a latrine or slaughterhouse? Well, you drank what you had. In towns, things weren't much better. Marketplaces stank of spoiled meat and rotting vegetables. Butchers threw scraps into the street. Fishmongers cleaned their catch on the spot, letting the guts flow into the gutter, and the gutter led nowhere. Rain helped. Sometimes, wealthier homes had a bit more control. Their kitchens were larger, sometimes separated from living quarters to prevent fires. They had servants to clean, to watch for mold, to shoo away animals. But even then, preservation was crude. Pests were persistent, and ignorance was universal. It's not that people didn't care. They did. But they didn't understand the connection between bacteria and illness. So they focused on what they could see, scraping mold off cheese, smelling meat to check if it was off, judging water by how it looked. Cooks developed instincts, some good, some not. Spices were used to mask off flavors. Sour ale was turned into cooking liquid. Pottage could hide a lot, and people built up tolerances. What would send us to the ER today might have just been a rough Tuesday for them. Still, many died. Children were especially vulnerable. So were the elderly. The line between nourishment and danger was thin. One bad batch, one dirty bucket, one spoiled loaf. Disaster. And through it all, the kitchen remained the heart of the home. It was where people gathered, ate, laughed, told stories. Even as it poisoned them, it comforted them. Even as it threatened their lives, it kept them going. So tonight, when you stand in your clean kitchen, water running freely, soap at the ready, fridge humming, think of the medieval cook, battling smoke, rats, and rot, feeding a family with nothing but instinct, fire, and hope. This was the kitchen before hygiene, a place of resilience, danger, and everyday bravery. Sleep tight. Next, we explore how faith shaped food. When the church told you what, when, and how to eat. Now, step out of the muddy fields and into a stone hall echoing with laughter, music, and the clatter of silver goblets. Welcome to the world of medieval nobility, where food wasn't just fuel, it was theater, power, and prestige, served on a gilded platter. While peasants counted crumbs, the elite orchestrated feasts that dazzled the senses. Picture this: long wooden tables covered in fine linens, lit by flickering candlelight, courtiers in embroidered robes, harpists and jesters performing. And at the center, a roast swan, wings reattached and feathers fluffed for dramatic flair. Noble dining wasn't just about eating, it was about being seen eating well. Every course, every dish was a statement, a message to guests, rivals, and subjects. Look how rich, how generous, how civilized we are. Food was currency. It bought loyalty, demonstrated wealth, and reinforced the divine right to rule. These feasts could go on for hours, sometimes days. And the menus? Towering. Dozens of courses, served in waves. Roasted boar with spiced apples, meat pies with golden crusts, stews rich with rare spices, fritters, jellies, marzipan sculptures, and fish dishes sculpted into mythical beasts. Spices were the real stars. Cinnamon, cloves, saffron, ginger, imported from faraway lands, at eye-watering prices. Using them showed not just wealth, but reach. A noble who served saffron was a noble who could touch the edges of the known world. But it wasn't all indulgence. Medieval elite food followed rules too. Meals were divided by social rank. The lord got the best cuts, the richest sauces. Guests of lower status were served simpler fare, further down the table. Even at a feast, Hierarchy ruled. Presentation mattered just as much as flavor. Food was often dyed with bright colors, shaped into animals, or arranged into symbolic patterns. A pie might be filled with live birds, released to flutter above the guests when cut open. Imagine eating under a cloud of doves, medieval dinner, and a show. And drinks flowed. Ale, mead, imported wines. The cups were large, the toasts loud, the spirits high. But just like with church-sanctioned feasts, gluttony was a sin. So nobles practiced selective restraint, eating delicately, using etiquette to show refinement, even as they consumed enough for 5. Servants kept the machine running. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of kitchen workers prepared the meals. Spit turners, sauce makers, pastry cooks, stewards, and more. The great halls had entire teams just to carve meat in specific ways. It was culinary choreography. But these opulent meals stood in stark contrast to the lives of the majority. A peasant walking past the castle might smell the roasted meats and never taste them. The scraps, if any, were sometimes given to the poor, but more often they fed the hounds. Still, for nobles, feasting was more than luxury. It was duty. Hospitality was sacred. A lord who fed his people during hard times earned their loyalty. A noblewoman who hosted a flawless banquet won social capital. Marriages were sealed with shared roasts. Alliances toasted over wine. Politics happened over platters. These events were also controlled spectacles. They followed rituals. Prayers opened the meals. Certain dishes had to be served first. Guests were seated strategically, the highest ranking always closest to the host, the lowest near the doors. Behind the splendor was structure, and behind the abundance, anxiety, because displaying wealth was also a way of hiding fear, of revolt, of failure, of famine. The feast was armor, and yet they were beautiful, moments of color and light in a dark world, a knight returning from war, a wedding, a victory, a holy day, the hall filled with song, laughter, and the clink of carved goblets. For one evening, the world made sense. The food was hot, the wine was endless, and the Lord was generous. So tonight, as you snack on whatever's in the fridge, imagine a roast peacock with feathers reattached. Imagine a bread sculpture taller than a child. Imagine eating by torchlight, surrounded by velvet and gold. This was noble dining, grand, strange, extravagant, and always, always performative. Sleep well, because tomorrow we follow the spice across deserts, seas, and secrets to discover the dangerous luxury hidden in a pinch of flavor. Close your eyes and picture a single clove, dry, brown, no bigger than a fingernail. In medieval Europe, it was worth its weight in silver, not because it filled you up, but because it made bland food tolerable and proved you had power. Welcome to the spice route, a journey of ships, caravans, deserts, danger, and desire. A route that stretched from the East Indies to the tables of European nobles, transforming not just meals, but empires. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron weren't just flavor. They were fantasy, mystery, wealth condensed into tiny, fragrant specks. In a world where most food tasted like boiled weeds or dried grain, a single pinch of spice was alchemy. It turned sludge into something royal. But to get those pinches, someone had to cross oceans, bribe sultans, dodge pirates, and survive months in brutal terrain. Spices came from lands most Europeans couldn't even imagine. India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. They traveled thousands of miles via camel train or merchant ship, and every mile added to their price. By the time a single peppercorn reached a European port, its cost had ballooned. Only the wealthy could afford regular use. A noble S pantry might contain a locked spice chest, literally a box with a key, because spices were that precious. Recipes from the elite kitchens of the day are packed with spices, not for balance, but for bragging rights. These exotic flavors also carried exotic meanings. Pepper was said to heat the blood. Cinnamon improved digestion. Nutmeg, a cure for plague. Or at least, people hoped. Spices weren't just luxury. They were medicine, magic, and myth. And yet, while nobles sipped clove-infused wine and sprinkled saffron on their fish, the poor watched in envy. Most peasants had never even smelled pepper, let alone tasted it. Their stews were seasoned with onions, garlic, and hope. Markets sometimes sold cheaper substitutes: ground up bark, dried roots, toasted grains dyed to look like spice powders. If a vendor offered pepper at peasant prices, it was probably fake or stolen. But even in the lower classes, the idea of spices held power. It was something to dream about. A better life had flavor. A better meal was warm, aromatic, exciting. In a sense, spices represented everything peasants didn't have, and everything they might aspire to. The spice trade wasn't just economic. It was geopolitical. It funded wars, launched explorations, and redrew maps. Cities rose and fell along the trade routes. Venice got rich, taxing spice imports. Portugal sailed around Africa, chasing a direct route. Spain bankrolled Columbus, not for gold, but for spices. And as Europe expanded its reach, it didn't just import spices, it conquered the places that grew them. Colonization, slavery, and violence followed the scent of cinnamon and cloves. Spice was delicious. Its legacy? Often bitter. Still, back in a medieval manner, a lord's use of spices was the ultimate flex. He could serve peppered venison, saffron rice, and clove-studded pastries, all in one meal. It was a way of saying, I can afford the world on my plate. Even the church used spices in its rituals. Incense filled with frankincense and myrrh, both part of the same global trade web. Prayers and pepper weren't so far apart. And during fast days, when meat and dairy were banned, spices helped fake the richness of forbidden foods. Almond milk stews with cinnamon, lentil pies with nutmeg. It was spiritual obedience, served with flair. But here's the irony. Spices, meant to elevate food, also highlighted its flaws. Why did meat need cloves? Because it was starting to spoil. Why so much ginger in a pie? To mask something questionable. Spices could transform a dish, but they also disguised decay. Still, people craved them, fought for them, died for them. So tonight, when you open your spice drawer, remember the centuries of ambition, risk, and conquest behind those tiny bottles. That dash of cinnamon? It once crossed a continent. That grind of pepper? It once financed a king. This was the spice route. Fragrant, fragile, and full of fire. Sleep well, because next time, we enter the darker part of this culinary tale. When the food ran out, and hunger ruled the land. It starts with a cold spring, too much rain. The wheat doesn't grow, or maybe it's a hot summer. The barley dries out. The harvest comes in thin, then thinner, then nothing. The granary is quiet. The animals grow nervous. People whisper. And just like that, hunger moves in. In medieval Europe, famine wasn't rare. It was part of life. a cruel visitor that showed up without warning and sometimes refused to leave. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the worst. Relentless rain drowned fields. Crops rotted. Hay couldn't dry, so livestock starved. People ate seed grain, knowing it meant nothing to plant the next year. Hunger became despair. In towns, bread lines stretched for hours. Markets ran dry. Prices doubled, then tripled. Bakers were mobbed. Merchants were robbed. People broke into monasteries, looking for food. In villages, meals shrank to nothing. Breakfast was a lie. Lunch, a memory. Dinner, if it happened, was boiled roots, nettle soup, or a slice of moldy bread saved from days before. People dug up old bones and boiled them for broth. When even weeds ran out, people got creative. Bark was ground into powder. Leather shoes were soaked and chewed. Dogs disappeared. Cats vanished. In the worst corners of the worst years, there are whispers of graves opened, of children stolen. The church offered prayers. The rich tightened their gates, and the poor endured, or didn't. Starvation changes a person. It sharpens the bones. It dims the eyes. It steals sleep, joy, memory. Entire villages were abandoned. Survivors moved on, leaving their dead behind. In response, people turned to desperate measures. Foraging became vital. Children were sent miles into forests to find berries or mushrooms. But that brought danger. Many mushrooms were deadly. Mistakes were common. Families ate what they didn't recognize, and sometimes no one woke up the next day. Some tried to trap birds, squirrels, even insects, anything with protein. Crows were roasted, rats were stewed, worms were swallowed whole. Communities sometimes pooled what little they had, shared pots, group foraging, rotated rations. It wasn't enough, but it helped a little. In a few places, lords opened their storehouses. Monasteries distributed thin porridge. These were acts of mercy and of control. A noble who fed his peasants earned their loyalty, or at least delayed revolt. But famine didn't just kill bodies, it killed cultures. Songs stopped, festivals vanished, traditions faded. No one wanted to dance when their stomachs screamed. After the famine came disease. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Plague and typhoid followed. Death wasn't just a visitor. It set up camp. And yet, somehow people survived. Those who endured carried scars and knowledge. They learned which routes were safe, which fields drained best, how to dry food, store it, ration it. Famine rewrote the cookbook of the poor. It taught survival in bitter lessons. So tonight, as you feel the weight of a full belly or pick between snacks, remember the centuries when hunger wasn't a metaphor. It was the weather. It was politics. It was everything. This was famine in the Middle Ages. Brutal, bleak, but not unbeatable. Sleep well. Next time, we'll end this journey where meals were reborn with the strange, slow transformation of medieval food into modern cuisine. It begins with a bubbling pot over a smoky hearth. A wooden spoon stirs slowly. The smell is vague. Some cabbage, maybe leeks. A hint of something boiled for too long. This is pottage, the mother of all medieval meals. A thick, shapeless stew of whatever you had, stretched with water and time. It was poor man's food, yes, but it was also the seed from which centuries of cuisine would grow. Let's rewind. In early medieval Europe, recipes weren't written down. Cooking was oral tradition, passed from grandmother to child, from house to house. The ingredients changed daily, depending on the season, what you had, or what was left over. There was no measuring, no timing, just feel. Pottage was the answer to everything. Didn't matter what it started with. Barley? Toss it in. A bone? Great. Some cabbage leaves, half an onion, a bit of bacon fat? Perfect. It simmered all day. It thickened. It changed. It was never the same twice. Over time, pottage evolved. As trade routes opened, new ingredients appeared. Spices, herbs, different grains. The pot got more interesting. Peasants still ate what they could scrape together. But now, that might include a pinch of pepper or a handful of lentils. Then came the rise of pies. At first, pies were just a way to store meat. The crusts were thick, hard, and inedible, just containers to keep the filling safe. But slowly, the idea caught on. People started making edible pastry. Flour, water, maybe a bit of fat. They filled it with meat, vegetables, or even dried fruit. The oven replaced the hearth. The plate replaced the pot. And suddenly, food had shape. In noble kitchens, pies became showpieces, intricate lattices, sculpted crusts. They told stories, displayed wealth. Some pies were filled with live birds, others with layers of fish and meat. They were culinary performance art. But the roots were still humble, just leftovers, baked. Cookbooks began to emerge. The first real medieval recipe collections were written in Latin or French, aimed at court cooks. Titles like The Form of Curry or Le Viandier listed dozens of preparations: roast swan, almond stews, meat jellies. These weren't meant for peasants, but their influence trickled down. Home cooks heard about these dishes. They simplified them, modified them, replaced expensive spices with local herbs, omitted the sugar, which was still rare. The names stayed fancy. The execution was creative. Recipes in these books were vague. Boil it well. Take good meat. Use sweet spices. It was up to the cook to fill in the blanks, because cooking was still craft, not science. A good dish depended on instinct, not instructions. Still, innovation happened. Soups diversified, broths became clearer, sometimes enriched with egg yolk or cream. Pancakes appeared. Cheese started to be used more in cooking, not just fresh, but aged and crumbled. Pickles and preserves became common in households that could afford a bit of salt or vinegar. Bread diversified too. From the dense, rough loaves of rye and barley, bakers started experimenting with wheat, flatbreads, round loaves, even early forms of what we might recognize as buns. The communal oven was the heart of the village. On baking day, everyone brought their dough to the fire. And then there were pastries, tarts filled with sweetened curd, hand pies with spiced meat, fruit baked with honey in shallow crusts. These were the bridge between medieval necessity and modern dessert. They were portable, practical, and, when sugar finally became cheaper, delicious. The Crusades played a strange role in this evolution. Soldiers returned from the East with stories of exotic foods. They'd tasted rice, lemons, spices like cardamom. Slowly, these ideas filtered into Europe's kitchens. New combinations appeared: lamb with mint, chicken with fruit. Dishes became more complex, layered. In monasteries, monks documented everything. Their recipe notes were part medicine, part theology, part culinary experiment. They preserved ancient Roman ideas and blended them with Christian fasting requirements. They didn't just record recipes, they elevated them. Then came trade. The Mediterranean bustled with ships. Venice became a culinary hub. Ingredients like almonds, sugar, raisins, and rice flowed north. A merchant might return with saffron and inspire 100 new dishes. By the 14th century, regional variation exploded. French food leaned toward buttery stews and sauces. English kitchens preferred roasted meats and pies. German recipes emphasized sourness, vinegar, fermented cabbage. Italian cooks fell in love with pasta and cheese. All of it was evolving, but slowly. Meals were still simple by modern standards. There was no uniformity, no food safety standards, no brands, just local tradition and whatever you could afford. What made medieval recipes special wasn't their perfection. It was their adaptability. They were blueprints, not blueprints. A fish pie might become a meat pie. A lentil stew might be thickened into a paste, then baked. Nothing was wasted. Everything changed. The late Middle Ages brought one more big shift. Printing. Books became more accessible. Cookbooks went from handwritten manuscripts to printed volumes. Now, even merchants and guild cooks could learn new dishes. Recipes started to include measurements, temperature suggestions, timing. It wasn't modern cooking yet, but it was getting close. And underneath it all was still that pot of pottage, boiling, bubbling, feeding a family. The taste might change. The ingredients might improve. But the idea was the same. Take what you have. Make it work. Feed the people you love. So tonight, whether you're microwaving a frozen meal or slow roasting a stew, remember that your kitchen is part of a long story. From wooden spoons over open fires to modern stainless steel ranges, the soul of cooking remains unchanged. This was the evolution of medieval recipes, from pottage to pie, from guesswork to guidance, from survival to flavor. Sleep well, because next we open the first true cookbooks and step into the moment when recipes became memory written in ink. Before the printing press, before Instagram food pics, before the word recipe even meant what it means today, people still had to cook, and they had to remember how. In a world where literacy was rare and measurements were vague, culinary knowledge passed from hands to mouths to minds. But eventually, someone started writing it down. Welcome to the birth of the cookbook. Imagine a medieval cook in a noble household. He's in charge of feeding dozens, maybe hundreds, of people. His kitchen is a chaos of a fire, steam, blood, herbs, shouting apprentices, and hungry lords. Every day, the menu changes. The expectations rise. The guests get pickier. And there's no written guide. For generations, recipes were oral. A master cook taught an apprentice by showing, not telling. A pinch here, a boil there, a whisper of spice. The apprentice memorized not just ingredients, but techniques, timing, textures. The knowledge was personal, tribal. If a cook died unexpectedly, so did the flavor of his dishes. But then came the first cookbooks, not mass-produced, not user-friendly. These were handwritten manuscripts, often in Latin or Old French, scribbled by monks, scholars, or kitchen clerks. They weren't meant for peasants or even average townsfolk. They were tools for elite kitchens and symbols of status. One of the earliest known is the Form of Curie, compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II around 1390. Curie meant cookery, and this wasn't a light read. It listed over 200 dishes, from spiced venison to almond milk stews, but it didn't list measurements, or cooking times, or temperatures. Instead, it gave rough directions. sometimes a single sentence. You had to know how to read between the lines. Literally, another was Le Viandier, attributed to Guillaume Tirel, also known as Taille-Levant. His book helped define French court cuisine. He included recipes for elaborate sauces, roasted birds, and decorative pies. Again, the instructions assumed you already knew what you were doing. These books weren't about teaching beginners. They were memory aids, status symbols, and sometimes political tools. Kings and nobles wanted their kitchens to reflect their power. A well-fed court was a stable one. A sophisticated feast impressed guests and intimidated rivals. Cookbooks helped standardize dishes across different estates. If the king liked his chicken with ginger and clove, every chef in his domain better learn that exact combination. But there was another reason for these books: knowledge preservation. Europe had just come out of the Black Death. Generations of people and their skills were wiped out. Writing things down became a way to guard against future loss. And yet, the books weren't just about survival. They were about transformation. The shift from pottage to pie, from spit-roasted everything to carefully layered stews, required documentation. As ingredients became more diverse, thanks to trade, conquest, and exploration, so did cooking. New methods needed new explanations. Old assumptions were no longer enough. By the late 1400s, with the printing press gaining momentum, cookbooks began to spread. In Italy, De Honesta Voluptate et Valetudine by Bartolomeo Platina combined cooking with health advice. He linked food to the humors, suggesting which meals balanced your body. In Germany, Küchenmeisterei became one of the first printed cookbooks for a broader audience. These books marked a cultural shift. Cooking was no longer just manual labor. It was intellectual, philosophical, political, and by putting recipes on paper, people began to imagine that food could be replicated, shared, improved. Of course, they still weren't easy to follow. A recipe might say, take some meat and boil it well. Some? How much is some? Boil how long? Over what fire? But they weren't about precision. They were about possibilities. A written recipe was an invitation to experiment, a foundation to build on, a glimpse into someone else's kitchen. And they weren't just technical, they were cultural artifacts. The choice of dishes, the ingredients used, the order of the courses. They reflected values, tastes, power structures. A cookbook was a portrait of its time. Still, not everyone had access. Most people couldn't read. Even fewer owned books. But the knowledge trickled down. A noble kitchen trained cooks who later moved to middle-class homes. Ideas spread by word of mouth. Recipes adapted to local ingredients. What started in a castle might eventually reach a village hearth, transformed, simplified, but still recognizable. Eventually, cookbooks began to include more detail, better organization, clearer instructions, and by the 1600s, they started to resemble what we know today. But the medieval cookbooks, those early scrolls and scribbles, were the genesis. They were the first attempt to turn food into a system, a language, a legacy. So tonight, when you follow a recipe with step-by-step photos, cooking times, and reviews, remember the world where cooks worked by memory, intuition, and firelight, where writing a recipe was a revolutionary act. This was the birth of the cookbook. Messy, magical, and utterly medieval. Sleep well. Our final journey awaits. The lasting legacy of these strange and hungry centuries. So here we are, At the end of a long, hard, and surprisingly flavorful road, we've wandered through smoky kitchens, stood in crowded feasting halls, crouched by hearths in muddy villages, and crossed deserts chasing a pinch of spice. The medieval world didn't just cook, it survived, adapted, and laid the groundwork for the meals we take for granted today. Looking back, the food of the Middle Ages wasn't just bad, it was complicated. It was a mirror of its society, raw, unpredictable, layered with rules, rich in meaning, and often unjust. What you ate said everything about who you were, your class, your faith, your luck. Hunger was common, safety was rare, pleasure, a luxury. But even in the bleakest kitchens, there was creativity. A peasant woman turning scraps into stew, a monk brewing ale with careful ritual, a noble chef sculpting marzipan into animals. The ingenuity it took to simply eat is staggering, and that ingenuity lives on. Today's obsession with local, seasonal, sustainable eating, that's medieval. Back then, you ate what was around you because you had no choice. The emphasis on preserving food, on reducing waste, on respecting the land, that was survival strategy in the 1300s. Our fascination with food presentation, with feasts and food shows, that's medieval too. Lords used food as propaganda. Banquets were politics. A roast swan wasn't just a meal, it was a message. Even the idea of cooking as an art, something worth studying, perfecting, documenting, started here. Those first messy manuscripts, those vague scribbled instructions, were the seeds of modern culinary education, of cookbooks, of Michelin stars. But perhaps the deepest legacy is one of empathy. To eat, for medieval people, was often to struggle, to fight rot, fire, rats, and famine, to be at the mercy of weather, wealth, and war. There was no guarantee of tomorrow's meal, and yet they kept cooking, kept feeding their children, kept celebrating when they could. It's easy to romanticize the past, to picture kings at long tables, peasants smiling by the fire, but the truth was harder and more human. Food is memory, it's culture, it's survival, and the Middle Ages gave us a taste of all three: rich, poor, bitter, and sweet. So next time you open a fridge, boil clean water, slice into fresh bread, pause. Remember the people who did all that in smoke-filled rooms, with bare hands and open hearts. This wasn't just about what they ate, it was about how they lived. And now, dear listener, may your dreams tonight be warm like stew, soft like bread, and long like the stories we've told. Because boring history, it's anything but, when it's told through the food that shaped us. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What time is it where you are right now? Are you watching from bed, the couch, a night shift break? Drop it in the comments. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel. And if you have ideas for the next sleepy deep dive, leave a suggestion below. What weird corner of history should we explore next? Secret societies, ancient inventions, the strange lives of historical criminals? Your feedback fuels this channel, so let me know what you loved, what you'd like to see, and whether this video helped you drift off. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, only if you truly enjoy this kind of journey. Thank you for sharing this midnight meal of memory. Good night.